Greetings, fellow wanderer. Recently I read a book by Paul Tillich, a thinker from the 20th century, described as a Christian existentialist. That book is The Courage to Be. Published in 1952 and born from a series of lectures he presented from 1950 to 1951, it tackles a polarity that defines much of the human experience, the tension between courage and anxiety. Tillich was born in the German Empire in 1886 and died in Chicago, Illinois, in 1965 at the age of 79. Over the course of his lifetime, he served as a chaplain in the German army in World War I. Tillich described World War I as the end of his period of preparation, a formative rupture that shaped his later concern with anxiety, faith, and the fragility of human existence. Upon the rise of the Nazi regime in 1933, Tillich was among the many academics dismissed from his position. This dismissal forced him into exile, and so he moved to America where, despite the difficulties of assimilation and learning English at age 47, he adjusted and eventually became the prolific thinker we know him as today. Tillich is often described as a Christian existentialist because he tried to express the Christian faith in modern philosophical language, translating traditional doctrines into terms that address the anxieties and questions of 20th century people. He remained deeply committed to theology and sought to present it in fresh ways that his contemporaries could understand and apply in everyday life. So what is a book written like a man Tillich all about? Well, obviously the book is about courage, but it's also about anxiety. Tillich is one of a few authors from his time that have a vested interest in the idea of polarity, and the polarity between courage and anxiety is at the heart of this book. So what's his premise? Anxiety is natural to life. This is not something we would like to admit. It goes against our desire for comfort and safety, but it is true. In different ways, we can sometimes resist this idea, whether by trying to push anxiety away, overcome it entirely, or move past it as quickly as possible. There are many ways we attempt to medicate or minimize anxiety in our modern world. This video is not meant to dissuade people from addressing their anxiety or working to reduce it. Far from that. Some anxiety is purely damaging, and every effort should be made to outgrow such anxieties. My goal is also not to disparage therapy, self-reliance, or any broader set of principles. Rather, my goal is to bring Tillich's words to light now, and to help us to better understand anxiety, to face it more directly, and to live life on life's own terms. In the book, Tillich presents to us the polarity between courage and anxiety. Courage to be, which can be understood as ontic self-affirmation, was for Tillich the supreme ethic. It is the ethic without which no other ethic or moral was possible to effectively develop. So what are courage and anxiety within this paradigm? Courage is the ability to affirm oneself in spite of anxiety. In both cases, Tillich refers here to existential or ontological courage and anxiety. Anxiety natural to the state of being, and the courage necessary to overcome it. There's nothing odd or deranged about someone for experiencing existential anxiety and wrestling with it using existential courage. All sapient beings must experience this anxiety and accept it as part of their life through courage. Importantly, Tillich differentiates anxiety from fear. Fear, he says, always has an object, whereas existential anxiety inherently has no object, since non-being is not an object. He adds further that anxiety, often taking on a life of its own, strives to become fear. That is, when we experience anxiety, our mind is likely to race to find a definite object upon which to pin that anxiety so that it may become a fear which may be conquered through definite action. The problem with existential anxiety, arising purely from the threat of non-being, which is not an object, it can never become a fear which may be once and for all conquered. Tillich's claim is that with few exceptions, we humans cannot tolerate our contingent nature, our non-being, and so we are always seeking an object at which to aim the feeling, anxiety, which arises from our awareness of it. Existential anxiety comes in three forms: the anxiety of death, the anxiety of condemnation, and the anxiety of meaninglessness. These are interconnected, but each strike from a different angle. The anxiety of death is the most basic form. It is the awareness of non-being. It threatens ontic self-affirmation. relatively in relation to fate and other matters outside our control, and absolutely in relation to our own death. The anxiety of condemnation threatens moral self-affirmation, relatively in relation to guilt, and absolutely in relation to condemnation. The anxiety of meaninglessness threatens spiritual self-affirmation, relatively in relation to emptiness, and absolutely in relation to the loss of meaning in both ourselves and the world. All three are interdependent and feed into one another. The anxiety of death is the simplest and most immediate. As finite beings, we know there was a time when we were not, and we know there will be a time when we may cease to be. The anxiety of condemnation arises from the gap between who we are and who we could, would, or should be. One way to understand this is through the image of a man who dies and is shown before God the life he might have lived had he remained faithful to the divine will. The anxiety here is the burden of moral incompleteness. The anxiety of meaninglessness is the awareness that neither our existence nor our meaning is guaranteed by nature. Meaning must be affirmed, not merely discovered, and that makes this form of anxiety especially difficult to accept. Most of us don't actually sit with existential anxiety. We avoid it, and this is one of Tillich's most potent warnings. When the natural anxiety of being alive is left unexamined, it morphs into neurotic or pathological anxiety, a phenomenon that is becoming more and more common in our 21st century world. Now, Tillich is careful to point out that this isn't a failure of willpower. Neurotic anxiety has real neurological roots, often tying into neurodivergence and the way a specific brain processes the world. This is why the psychiatrist is so vital. But Tillich argues it's a two-sided problem. It is simultaneously a biological reality and a spiritual or existential coping mechanism. Because of this, both the doctor and the counselor hit strict limits when trying to treat it alone. A psychiatrist cannot medicate a lack of meaning, and a counselor cannot think away a hyperactive nervous system. They have to work together. When our nervous system is overwhelmed, our psyche tries to protect us by pulling back. It imposes a self-limiting boundary to shield us from that deeper existential dread. It's like frantically sealing yourself inside a small box to escape the chaos outside. It's a completely understandable survival instinct. But the tragedy is that in trying to secure safety, we accidentally shrink the boundaries of our own lives. Ultimately, these artificial walls provide no real relief against existential anxiety, and end up only resulting in a different, neurotic type of anxiety. But how does this actually play out? To my mind, this ties in heavily with ideas from Jungian psychology regarding personas and the shadow. It is not the goal here to explain these concepts in full depth. I'm not even qualified to do that. But a cursory explanation is necessary. For Jung, the psyche was large and made up of multiple parts, falling into either conscious or unconscious elements. The conscious part is what we know of ourselves, and is by far the smaller of the two sides. Closely tied to this conscious identity is what Jung describes as personas. This concept is well known today. The idea that we put on certain masks for others in order to protect both them and ourselves from full contact with who we are. It is helpful to understand that there is no set number for these personas. It's not like you can open up the brain and look clearly at each one. They mix, intermingle, arise, and subside as needs demand. While we may identify with them consciously, they are often shaped by forces outside of our immediate awareness. Awareness of them is not common, but their actions and motivations can be clearly seen with keen observation. We all know that we act different ways for different people. This is not a point of contention for anyone. What's so helpful about Jungian psychology's take on personas is the understanding that they are not merely tools we use for expedience. While they serve a social function, they can also operate automatically, arising without deliberate choice and fading once no longer needed. They are influenced by deeper structures within the psyche and are not always fully under conscious control. Often only through reflection, introspection, and guidance from others can we begin to see them more clearly. This brings us to the concept of the shadow. You see, every persona reflects a particular way of presenting ourselves to the world. In doing so, other aspects of ourself are left out. Over time, these unexpressed or disowned parts of the self form what Jung called the shadow. All humans inevitably find parts of themselves unacceptable or undesirable. There can be any number of reasons these aversions arise over the course of our lives. but our childhood and family of origin is a great place to begin the search for those who are interested. The shadow is what forms when aspects of ourselves, thoughts, beliefs, desires, and impulses, are pushed out of our conscious awareness or rejected by the identities we maintain. Listen carefully, because this is an important point in Jungian psychology. There is no such thing as rejecting a part of ourselves out of existence. As I mentioned, these elements of the psyche do not simply disappear. You cannot wish them away. They are, after all, still part of you. If we refuse to take into account what they have to say, or fail to engage with them consciously, they do not remain silent. Instead, they tend to express themselves indirectly, emerging through behavior, emotion, or reaction in ways we do not fully understand. At times, this can be disruptive or even damaging, particularly when it goes unexamined for long periods of time. This is the Jungian concept of the shadow. At the same time, it is important to recognize that the shadow is not purely negative. It contains not only what we reject as unacceptable, but also parts of ourselves that were never fully developed or allowed expression. This is why looking into our childhood and family of origin is a great place to begin what Jungian psychology calls shadow work. What makes the shadow difficult is not simply its content, but our lack of relationship to it. This is where Jung's ideas of persona and shadow begin to connect with Tillich's understanding of neurotic anxiety. Without conscious awareness, we come to see ourselves through the limited lens of the personas we adopt for protection and adaptation. But these personas are not the whole of who we are. They are partial, shaped by circumstance and tied to specific contexts. Here's a personal example. Being married, I have a husband persona. Now, this husband persona can be helpful, and often is helpful. He tells me to treat my wife with care, understanding, and respect. He spurs me on to clean the house, to make sure the cars are in working order, to take the trash out every Tuesday, to be loving and self-sacrificial. These are all good things, it would seem, but he is still a persona. The problem isn't that he exists. The problem is my tendency to conflate myself with him unconsciously. If I am not aware that I am playing this role, and instead believe that I am nothing more than the role, I begin to move toward neurotic anxiety. For example, my wife may spend time unhappy. I'm likely to notice this since I see her every day. My husband persona may begin looking for reasons that she is upset, and, in its narrowness, may make it about me. A good husband has a wife who is happy. My wife is unhappy, therefore I am not a good husband. If I'm not a good husband, I'm nothing. This is not true in any full sense, but within the limited frame of that persona, it can feel entirely true. The persona begins and ends as a husband. It does not account for the larger whole of who I am. The anxiety I feel in this situation is neurotic to the extent that it arises from that limitation. I am a husband and nothing more. If I were grounded in a broader and more complex sense of self, I might still care deeply about my wife's unhappiness, and even take responsibility where appropriate, but my entire being would not feel threatened by it. I would remain intact because I am more than my role as a husband. If we understand this in principle, we can begin to see how it extends to other areas of life. My father persona may feel threatened when my children are sick or struggling. My teacher persona may feel threatened when students perform poorly or when I receive criticism from my superiors. My smart persona may feel threatened when I don't know the answer. My friend persona may feel threatened when interactions don't go as expected. The list is nearly infinite. To the degree that I unconsciously identify with these personas, anxiety can become intensified and distorted. When a role is threatened, it can begin to feel as though I am threatened in my entirety. In this way, my identification with my persona becomes neurotic. What is, in reality, a limited threat begins to take on the weight of an existential one. What feels existential to the persona I identify with is neurotic anxiety for me. I would posit that much of this self-limiting occurs as an unconscious defense mechanism implemented in order to avoid existential anxiety. Our attachment to personas keeps us shielded from existential anxiety, but also leaves us vulnerable to neurotic anxiety when those roles inevitably shift or fall away. This is why what Tillich said about anxiety striving to become fear is important to me. When I sit alone, I feel existential anxiety. I don't like the feeling, so instead I strive to make that feeling about something else. I'm just lonely. I just need to be of use somewhere. I'm just bored. I should do something fun. Taking those cues, I latch on to the most readily available persona and go to work hiding from that feeling of existential anxiety. For me, it's usually the smart persona, and I start reading and then texting people what I've read so they can affirm that I'm smart, and then I can feel better. But how do I move past something nefarious like that? How do I cope with my life when I know one day my being will cease? How do I accept myself when I know I'm doing far less than I'm capable of? And I'm scared to even attempt to undertake what I believe is my true potential, because if I fail, then I'll really be finished. How do I move forward knowing that nothing I choose carries meaning in itself, and that I must not only choose my meaning, but affirm it without outside approval or external aid? Just me, and if I believe in Him, God, standing up against non-being, the condemnation of who I am versus who I could be, and the abyss of no inherent meaning. These are the big questions. Most people never bother to even ask them, but we have all felt them, each one of us. Personas in the shadow I create through my unconscious curation of them are, among other things, protections against existential anxiety. Identification with my personas, which occurs inevitably without conscious introspection, unfortunately results in rampant neurotic anxiety. If I am to begin to outgrow neurotic anxiety, I must begin to see my personas for what they are, tools and adaptations, and begin to dig down into the unconscious elements of myself that I've rejected in my formation of those personas, shadow work. Integration is the key here. As I begin to integrate, my neurotic anxiety lessens, and I begin to live life on even footing. As life comes into clearer view, existential anxiety will begin to creep in. Then I will be faced with a most difficult choice. I can either shrink away, ultimately choosing a smaller, limited life, returning to a neurotic anxiety that I can manage, or I can push forward onto the path of what Jung called individuation. If I choose that path, then maybe I can begin to sit alone in the deafening silence of existential anxiety. I'd love to hear how my thoughts sit with your own experience. Until next time, mind yourself and keep on wandering.